We left off on our last video on this worksheet, 9.2.3 in your yellow workbook, going along with adult requests. I'm going to highlight some of these things and then you can read the rest on your own and take some more notes. First of all, teaching children to go along with reasonable and appropriate adult requests is important to their success in life. And it means being willing to follow rules, being open to learning new behaviors, and acting in a way that helps you get along with others. Children who go along with adult requests typically ask how and not why when given a request from a parent or teacher. The children who don't go along with requests also tend to focus on what's wrong with the request, and they tend to nitpick and argue about it. I'm sure you've experienced this with some of your kids before where you ask them to do something and all they can focus on is what they don't like about that request. The more that we encourage them to comply with what we're asking them to do, the less likely they are to be nitpicky about it. Children who are not trained to go along with adult requests often end up having antisocial behaviors at home, at school, and in the community. These behaviors can get in the way of learning social skills or getting along with peers and adults, and also get in the way of gaining academic skills. This can be really common in school when kids go to kindergarten or first grade and they're having a hard time following the instructions of the teacher. It really can start to affect their academic success because if they're not able to follow rules in the classroom, then they're more likely to not be able to focus on their schoolwork and complete those things that they need to get done. So there's a lot of other reasons why it's important for our kids to go along with adult requests and for them to become familiar with going along with those requests from other trusted, caring adults in their lives. Children who engage in these antisocial behaviors can be a target for anger and rejection by both peers and adults. If your child is having any of these problems, it's important to reach out to other responsible, caring adults in their lives, such as teachers or counselors, or maybe a family friend or someone else that is very involved in your child's life. The more children that have caring adults in their corner who are caring for them, the more likely they are to be successful. So I'd encourage you, if you're feeling like you're maybe concerned about any of these things, or you're just noticing some certain types of behaviors, reach out to any of those other adults that know your kid really well and ask them what they notice too. And you guys can collaborate and come up with a plan that can really help to support your child. So the more people that are working together to support and love a child, the more likely they are for that child to be successful. So you can take a second and finish reading this worksheet and then highlight any other things that stand out to you. Next, we're going to discuss reasonable expectations on 9.2.4. When you're setting up rules and consequences for your children, especially if they're not used to them, you should expect one or more of the following: that they're not going to like the rules and that they're going to challenge the rules. This is really common for kids to not like rules that we set up because it's putting, restrictions maybe on some of the things that they really want to do or that they really like. So it'd be normal for them to not like them. They might test you and hassle you about the rules or consequences, and their behavior is probably going to get worse before it gets better. You can also expect to implement emotion regulation to stay calm, firm, and fair. When you are starting to implement new rules, this might cause you to get a little bit frustrated. This is a great time for you yourself to practice those emotion regulation skills along with your children. You can expect to take a time out for yourself to regain your composure and then go back to interacting with your children. And you might feel like giving up, but don't do it. Expect that if you're consistent, your children will begin to comply with the new rules. And you might blow it sometimes. And you can expect to say, "I'm sorry," if you've been too harsh. This can be a really powerful thing too, when we can recognize the results of our actions and go back to our kids and say, "Hey, you know what? I might have responded too harshly in that," and let them know that you recognize that and then have a conversation about that. That can be really powerful too, especially if we as adults know that we may have responded out of our emotions. You can expect change to your child's behavior after 2 to 4 weeks of consistent parenting behavior from you. One thing this makes me think of is when we as adults are trying to form habits. If we're starting to implement a new exercise routine, for example, it's going to take a few weeks before we actually make that a routine and a habit in our lives. If we can stay consistent with our kids' new rules that we're implementing, they're more likely to make that a habit in their lives too. So it's going to take a while for them to really make this a routine and really make this a habit. But the more consistent we are with them, the more likely they are to follow through, and the more likely they are to make this, something that they are regularly doing in their lives. You can also expect that you may need to add, delete, or change rules once you've lived with them for a while. It's always good to go back and reassess and see what things are working and what things you might want to change. And lastly, expect that your children will do better with rules and consistent consequences than without. You can take a minute to read through this again or take notes or highlight anything else that you'd like. Next, we're going to talk about how to use logical consequences. Logical consequences are used to motivate children to stop certain behaviors. Logical consequences are put in place by parents as a response to inappropriate behavior, breaking a family rule, violating a family value, or not complying with parent directions. You should come up with logical consequences before there are problems. When you have to think of logical consequences in the heat of the moment, they're less likely to be logical and maybe unreasonable. This is sometimes if we're responding too harshly out of our emotions, this can happen. So the more that we plan ahead of time, the more likely we are to give a reasonable consequence. They should be related to the behavior, respectful of the child's dignity, and reasonable. They can also include loss of privilege or the 5-minute work chores. And when delivering a consequence, do it calmly, firmly, without anger, and with empathy. This is where the emotion regulation kicks in. For example, you could say, because you were late, you lose your going out privileges next weekend. You can try again the following weekend. When the consequence is over, it's over. This is really important for us as adults to remember that after our kids have received their consequence, it's time to move on, even for us as adults, and to not dwell on what the behavior was any longer. And lastly, if you have allowed your children to experience reasonable natural consequences, let the consequence do the teaching. Lastly, here's some ideas for logical rewards. This can include parent time. Maybe you play a special game with your child, or you have a special story time where you read a story aloud to your kids. Or you might get to go to the library, or maybe they help you cook or bake. Anything that's spending quality time with you can be a great reward. Another option is special outings. Going to a movie, getting ice cream, going swimming, or maybe your kids get to go to a special event like a party or a dance. Or special privileges. Maybe that includes watching TV or playing video games. Maybe they get to go on a scavenger hunt or earn some money or have a friend stay overnight. Take a second to write down some logical rewards that you could implement for your children. The next thing we're going to do is in our purple workbooks, go to 9.2.7. This is entitled Plan for Teaching New Skills. You're going to choose one child and one skill that you'd like to teach that child. You can write their name and the skill on those 2 lines at the top. Then we're going to break down into 4 or 5 steps the process of teaching them that skill. The new skill that I chose was washing the dishes. So first, I would tell my child, fill the sink with hot water and 1 squirt of dish soap. Number 2, place dishes in the sink. Number 3, scrub dishes with scrub brush until no longer greasy and no food is on the dishes. Number 4, rinse dishes under hot water until all the soap is gone. And number 5, set dishes in the dish drainer to air dry. I kept my directions as short and concise as possible so that there's more of a chance that my child will be successful and they'll feel confident in what they're supposed to do. Another important thing to note is that you will have to model this for your children as well, because your idea of 1 squirt of dish soap might be really different than what their idea of 1 squirt of dish soap is. And they're going to need to know how much to fill the sink with water, and maybe how hot to make the water. And there's so many different things that will need to be modeled for them as well. The more likely they are to be successful if we model for them and we tell them what to do. You can take a second and write down the steps for teaching a new skill to one of your children. now we're going to circle back to our learning goal. My learning goal is that I would like to come up with family rules and appropriate consequences for compliance and non-compliance for my child. I learned the difference between natural and logical consequences and how both of these things play a role in shaping our behavior. And I got some excellent ideas of logical consequences I can implement when my child does not follow directions. I plan to try these things along with encouragements. Take a second to wrap up your learning goal for this lesson.